We're already way over time. We're supposed to be in our break, and like everybody else, I want to say a few things. So I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. And what I want to say, though, to begin with, is a bit of a warning, because this might come across as a rather critical talk, and rather critical of certain aspects of the coming together of Buddhism and science. But nothing could actually be farther from the truth. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm doing it because it's a love affair as a Buddhist and as somebody who has been hacking things for 60 years. I hacked into my father's ham radio system a long, long time ago, and so hacking consciousness is a very natural thing, both to me personally, but also to the Buddhists. And so the Buddhist technologies of awareness that I refer to go way, way back. And so now we have new kinds of technologies, and it's very natural that Buddhism comes together with these. But at the same time, coming from the Buddhist side of the fence, I have a lot of concerns about this. And so I want my Buddhist technologies of awareness to be founded on the very best science and the very best of our cognitive philosophies. So when I'm critical, it's only because I'm very, very excited about all this and very positive about this. So let's see, how do we do this? Okay, not too hard. Simple technologies. So I've been working for some time at Smith College with a professor in the psychology department, Dr. Phil. Not Dr. Phil from the TV show, but Dr. Phil Peake, who's sitting out there in the audience. And we've been teaching classes on well-being from Buddhist and psychological points of view. And in part of that, we've been looking at the literature, especially what I call the happiness industry. Everybody wants to be happier. Everywhere you go, everybody wants to be happier. And so I have some natural questions about this, but it starts, as I said, from my point of view as a Buddhist and as a Buddhist scholar. Buddhism has always been very open to technologies, and so Buddhism is very well known these days. It's one of the reasons that there's such a great dialogue between Buddhism and science. Buddhism has put out what's called the welcome mat. The Buddhists have welcomed scientists into their discussions and their dialogues, and have even gone so far as to say, if science disproves some tenet of our belief system, we have to jettison, we have to get rid of that idea. So if you can't find Mount Meru in the center of the universe, Buddhists are pretty okay with just getting rid of the whole idea and moving on to different ways of looking at things. So from my point of view, there's a number of very interesting questions. And among these is the happiness that's talked about by the psychologists at all the same as the nirvana that is the goal of the Buddhists? We can also ask, can I become a Buddha? I mean, when we look at what a Buddha is defined as, classically speaking, I want to ask the neurobiological, the physiological question of whether that is, in fact, a human potential or a human capacity. There's questions about rebirth that I'm not going to have time to talk about today, and there's also questions about suffering. The first noble truth, as many of you know, is life is suffering, dukkha. And science doesn't seem to bear that out. Actually, most people do not describe their lives as a pervasive experience of suffering. I'm having a very good time right here, right now, and I think most of my friends are having a good time right now. So, I mean, we need to be more nuanced in the Buddhist question about that, but it's a real and an important question. And so, as I said, the idea of technologies of awareness is very possible. People talk about enlightenment pills, the Nirvana drug, and all sorts of other kinds of technologies to change the way we go about things. What about a wire head? You know, there's people maybe in the audience who have a wire in their heart to control their heartbeat, to control their arrhythmia. What about a wire in our brain that can eliminate some of the effects of depression or bipolar disorder or other kinds of things? We might think that Prozac is a rather dull instrument right now, and I do think it's a rather dull instrument, but I have faith in technology, and I think that we're going to get better. So, you know, if you could do it, if it came to that point, would you sign up? Would you get in line for those kinds of technologies? So, in other words, what I'm talking about here is what we now call embodied consciousness, embodied mind. We understand, as Professor just explained to us, that when we say consciousness only in a Buddhist point of view, this doesn't mean that there's some fluffy woo-woo consciousness out there swooping around the universe that exists independent of us. What we explicitly mean in the Buddhist tradition is that consciousness arises from within us. Right? We give rise to consciousness. So, if that's the case, if it's a deeply somatic experience, as people now talk about it, then we can ask the question. So neuroplasticity is really rather common now. You know, change your mind and change your brain, right? Change the way you think and change the meat, change the physical brain. What if we can go the other way? This is my question for the trans tech people. You know, what if we can change the brain, change the meat, change the physical stuff, and thereby change our consciousness? So then we have the things like the cyborg Buddha that Dr. Hughes will talk to us about later. So we can ask the question, you know, there's neuroscience is everywhere. You can't open anything that doesn't have neuroscience involved in it somewhere. There's the neuroscience of everything from candy bars to Donald Trump. Sometimes you get the feeling that maybe this is neurophrenology. I don't know if you know the old science of phrenology, the idea that the bumps on your head, and monks have more bumps that we can see, right? Do the bumps on your head actually tell us something about your brain? In other words, is this pseudoscience? Is this neuroscience? Or is this pseudoscience? So my first question, a very simple, basic question for those of us that are in this dialogue is, does nirvana, the goal for Buddhists, equal happiness? And the simple answer is, not a chance in hell, right? They're very, very different kinds of things. When we talk about happiness, the folks in the positive psychology field talk about happiness in terms of flourishing, satisfaction, extreme well-being. Sometimes they talk about it as a state of flow, of being in the moment. And those are the kinds of things that Buddhists like to talk, or that the happiness people like to talk about. Flourishing, sometimes eudaimonia, is also very popular in that way of talking about what we want to be, how we want to understand our well-being. Buddhists typically do not talk in those kinds of terms. Buddhists talk about the elimination of suffering, getting out of suffering, eliminating all suffering, and thereby kind of as a bonus, also getting out of rebirth, right? So keep this in mind, as I think it's a very important discussion when the scientists and the Buddhists come together, is that for Buddhists, one of the most important drives, I'm going to say this is probably true for pan-Indian religions of the Buddhist time as well, getting out of samsara is the point. No more birth in samsara. Rebirth in the Pure Land is okay, but rebirth in samsara is not what the Buddhists want. So in the spirit of sort of the Buddhist description of getting out of something or the negation of something, I want to start with some things about what nirvana is not. Nirvana is not a denial of learning. Ooh, I just lost my screen here. If this can come back somehow, that would be nice. Okay, well then I'll look over there. Nirvana is not a denial of learning, a regression, a childlike innocence, or the uninhibited emotional expression of that kind of childlike innocence. Nirvana is not a trance state of union, an altered state of consciousness, permanent bliss, a state of in-the-moment ecstasy or flow. And this isn't to say that Buddhists have not developed technologies, typically the jhana states, that allow for those sort of ecstatic states, but those are never considered the goal. In the descriptions of the Buddha's awakening, he goes up through these ecstatic states, but then he comes back down, and he exits laterally, and he begins to think about things. He begins to think about the question of life and suffering, and that's what constitutes his awakening. How do I go back a slide? That one? Okay, I don't know. This is gone up there. If there's any techie people that can, so I don't like turning and staring at the stage. So, so nirvana is also not, in this continued state, a kind of subjugation, a surrender to a higher power, somehow beyond the self to some other thing. I mean, you can't go beyond the self in Buddhism because the first part of Buddhism is anatman, or the denial of self. And it certainly is not beyond conceptual thought, some kind of non-discriminating wisdom or unconstructed consciousness. We spent a lot of time talking about consciousness lately. Unconstructed consciousness or non-contingent consciousness is an oxymoron in Buddhist terms. Consciousness is precisely constructed. It's part of our psychophysical being. So in the tradition itself, nirvana is typically described as the cessation of all negative or cognitive or emotional hindrances, such as especially greed, hatred, and ignorance, as well as thereby the complete elimination of suffering and a cessation of rebirth, and finally, true happiness. And so the bliss of happiness, the bliss of Nirvana, I'm sorry, is not the fleeting happiness of finding a good parking place or winning the lottery, job satisfaction, or a loving relationship with your partner. These are what Buddhists call mundane happiness or daily happiness. The Buddhist happiness is a much more lasting, enduring kind of equanimity that is not at all, that has no traction in the real world. And so this gives us two kinds of approaches to what Buddhism is. One is that is all negative states or affliction, and then the other is concerned with what you get at that point. And so, you know, all of this gone forever. And I'm going to come back to this because this is kind of the neurobiological question that I'm interested in, is the possibility of the complete elimination of aversion or attraction. And so for Buddhists, happiness is described as much, much more. It's much different from the happiness of positive psychology. It's this kind of radical happiness. It's non-contingent happiness. It's unrelated to this kind of a real world. And this is, as I said, a question I want to come back to in terms of the possibility of this. And so the first question I want to ask is about this kind of non-contingent happiness, that is happiness that has nothing to do with anything that happens to you in your real life, whether or not this is possible. And a lot of psychologists would say that just from the get-go, it doesn't work very well. You know, that the idea of some state of mind, some emotional existence that has nothing to do with the vicissitudes of your world, getting a parking space, having a loving partner, and all of those kinds of things, is in fact rather quixotic and perhaps a goal that is nowhere possible. And so, you know, one of the most obvious difficulties with this description of a non-contingent, perfect, lasting happiness is that it would somehow have to be capable of existing in a way that bypasses all of the clearly contingent and conditioned wiring and firing of our brains, right? Because for both Buddhist thinkers as well as modern psychology, it's our mind and it's our physical place that is the source of negativity. So take fear, for example. Right? Fear is something that Buddhists don't have. And this is the classic, you know, fight or flight kind of thing, right? Is it a snake or a rope? And so, you know, maybe you're in Burma and you're in the middle of a meditation retreat. You've been meditating for 10 days. You're very calm. You're very chilled out. Everything's going, and you decide to take a walk through the forest, right? But still, you know, it is a forest. It is Burma, and stuff happens. So you have a mild state of vigilance. You have a mild state of a concern with where you go as you walk through the forest late at night. This is kind of a non-focused state. There's a little bit of a threat assessment that's going on in the background. Your sympathetic nervous system is alive. Your sense organs are alerted. The endocrine system is kind of maybe a warm state. Stimulants like adrenaline and others are present. And the amygdala is also ready and willing to go. But still, you know, it's a nice night for a walk. It's warm. You're a very calm state, and so you decide to go out for a walk on the forest path, and then, bam, there's the forest path, right? Very nice. Looks kind of a little bit sunny here, but all of a sudden, as you're walking down the path, there it is, the snake, right? And you freak out. Beginning with everything involved in the visual process, information is fast-tracked to your amygdala. All of the systems involved in higher level vigilance kicks into gear. The sympathetic nervous system takes over, releasing ever greater amounts of neurochemicals, further stimulating the amygdala, just as it inhibits the hippocampus, relating to a chance for maybe more nuanced memory of things. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure, the release of cortisol, all of these kinds of stressor takes place, and there you've got it, the famous fight or flight syndrome. Still though, hopefully, higher level processes take over. Your frontal cortex begins to kick in, gets into the act, and you notice that other people walking down the path are not scared. You sort of realize that actually there's no reports of snakes in the area for a long time, and before long you calm down and you see that in fact it's not a snake, and you continue on with your peaceful walk. So the question is, to my mind, is it possible, right, to walk down that path without any of that stuff coming into play? And, you know, would you want to? There's a place. I mean, we talk a lot of times these days about kind of our reptilian, earlier brainstem functions versus our more recent cortical kinds of functions. But there still is a place in our world for the fight or flight syndrome. And so, you know, while I think it's quite certain that these kinds of fear responses can indeed be modulated. They can be attenuated. You certainly can train yourself to be better at all of these kinds of things. Whether they can be completely eliminated or whether they should be completely eliminated is open to question. But keep in mind, Buddhas have no fear, right? This is the famous story of the elephant that attacked the Buddha, right? This is Suchi in the Abhaya Mudra, the have no fear mudra. Buddhas have no fear. I love my snake. This is in Vietnam, not Burma. I love my snake, but I was still scared out of my pants when I first put that snake around my neck, okay? And it worked out, and I'm quite happy about that. So, to put this in kind of Buddhist perspective, the question is, can we eliminate these paths between our meat? You know, I refer to the meat, meaning the mind and the body. Can we completely eliminate all of these kind of processes that lead from our experience of the world to our various emotions that exist in the world? And can we break the chain between all of that? And then earlier we were talking about dopamine. You know, how about dopamine? Now, when you meditate, it's very clear, it was mentioned in the earlier talk, dopamine increases when you meditate. And when the dopamine wears off, you want to get back on the cushion. You know, you do more things to increase the level of dopamine in your contemplative experience. So we could ask the question, you know, is the Buddha free of dopamine? Did the Buddha not have those kinds of biochemical responses as he was experiencing his bliss? How do we get more of all of that kind of stuff? So this is from my friend out there, Dr. Phil. And we were talking about this at one point, and he said, a simple way to think about the brain as it relates to behavior is that it consists of two systems: an approach system, which in Buddhist terms we would call desire, and an avoidance system, which in Buddhist terms we would call hatred, or something like that, right? And these systems are oftentimes represented in different ways, but they're definitely systems. I'm not exactly sure how this is going over here. And the body is working to maintain a homeostasis in the body. So when the body signals hunger, the approach system looks for food. And the avoidance system tries to be sure that you don't get hurt finding it or eating it, or getting eaten on the way to eating, right? And so the simple metaphor that can be applied to most systems in the body that are monitored, hunger, thirst, warmth, things like that, are the things we desire or crave or things that we try to avoid. And note that the system is so efficient that much of this, of course, goes on without our even thinking about it, right? These are autonomic kinds of responses. However, the craving and the aversion still exist and will be triggered whenever one of the homeostatic monitors tells the brain that something out of whack. When you're hungry, you start to want some food. This is not from outer space, this is from within your neurochemical, neurobiological system. And without craving, without aversion, without trying to avoid dangerous states, you would no longer engage in behaviors to restore homeostasis, and you would die. Okay? There's one way of looking at all of this, since this is what the Buddhist approach is, right? The Buddhism is completely avoiding aversion and craving, right? Attraction and avoidance. And it is true, I think one way, if you're an evolutionary biologist or evolutionary psychologist, you could say that indeed, Buddhism is going against the evolutionary biological impulse of the species. Remember I said Buddhism wants out. The goal of Buddhism is no more rebirth, out of the productive and reproductive system. So it's quite easy to understand that Buddhism is in fact exactly advocating this, exactly advocating a way to get out of all of that. To put it in classical Buddhist terms, consciousness cannot originate unconstructed consciousness. Consciousness itself is constructed. To put it in terms of intentional action, as we have here from a very famous Zen teacher, all karma is, by definition, action that is tainted by desire, aversion, and ignorance, and therefore can only lead to more of the same. Or, as we have here, if you're trying to attain enlightenment, you are being driven by karma and creating more karma, and you're wasting your time on your cushion. Here we have, so my question is, are we neurobiological Echantaka? That's one for the translators out there. And Echantaka is somebody who has no possible way of getting out of this. So there's lots of other things that we've talked about here, and we've talked a little bit about these kinds of things that you can't avoid because you're human, right? There are perceptuals. You have holes in the middle of your eyes. You have only 10% of your visual receptors are capable of experiencing color. Yet when you look at the world, you see a unified field of color, right? This is the way we see the world. This is the way we want to see the world. I don't want to see reality as it is actually presented to my eyes. I prefer the distortion that my conception gives to my perception. This is the thing, the Cartesian dualism. We are no longer thinking in those terms. We are embodied. Our consciousness is informed by our body. And I find that to be a very good thing, because I think that what this allows us is the possibility of practice, right? It's precisely because consciousness is physical that we have the opportunity to change it. It's precisely because suffering has a neurobiological, physical origin that we can change it, because we are embodied beings, right? And this leads to the kinds of technologies that we've been talking about here today, all of these studies, putting people in fMR machines. And why do we study these things? It's because the consciousness that we discover in advanced meditators is not off the charts. It doesn't exist in some absolute realm of consciousness that is somehow undefined by the physical processes. It is in fact precisely physical. That's why we can measure it. And that's why I'm so hopeful about these kinds of things. I'm going to skip all of this kind of stuff, left and right brain. The lucky thing these days is that control is back in fashion. The left side, for those of you who are scientists and academics, the left side of your thinking brain is now back in vogue as the source of happiness. It helps you to avoid emotional hijacks. This is what all of these kinds of things are about. Back to the apps that we have for these things that I'm going to skip. This is for Fred over there, one of his colleagues. Meditate like a Zen master at the push of a button. Right? Can we artificially induce the brain states of Zen masters with pills and other kinds of means? But what I want to say here, I'm going to close with this. What I want to say is that all of the attention so far has been put on meditating monks and nuns in the lab. Right? Everybody's very excited about meditation. All of the apps that we have out there are meditation apps. How to increase your concentration, how to increase your stress reduction, and all of those kinds of things. As a Buddhist, I know very well that meditation is but one part. It's this part down here on the bottom. It's kind of simplified into three things over there. The concentration, the meditation practices are only one part of the picture. There's other parts. Knowing, right? Buddhism is not demonizing thought and cognition. It actually celebrates it. It just wants to do it better. And the most important one, I think, is the idea of ethical action, which is not talked about almost at all in the kinds of studies of meditation. And so, to my mind, it's morality and practice in the world. So we have an emphasis on society in some of these studies, and that to me is where the action is. And so, morality might not be rocket science, but in fact, maybe it's a more important science for living human beings. Thank you very much.